Hello everyone, we will start with the new chapter, that is New Empires and Kingdoms. First topic in this chapter is about Prashasti. So let's get to know what the Prashasti is. Prashasti is a Sanskrit word meaning in praise of. It's basically a poem or inscription written to honor and glorify a ruler. These were often carved on pillars or stone tablet. The main purpose of Prashasti was to highlight a ruler's victories, virtues, and achievements, often making them look like godlike figures. Prashastis became very important during the Gupta period. While earlier inscriptions like Ashoka's were more about laws and morals, Prashasti focused on praising the king. These poems were usually written by court poets or ministers who would tell stories of the ruler's success and power. Let's take the example of Samudragupta, which is given here. Now, Samudragupta was one of the most famous Gupta rulers. His Prashasti is inscribed on the Ashokan pillar at Allahabad. It was written by Harisena, who was both a poet and a minister in Samudragupta's court. This Prashasti is a Kavya. Kavya means a Sanskrit poem, and it tells about Samudragupta's military victories, his kindness to defeated rulers, and his love for art and culture. It even portrays him as a godlike figure, showing how rulers used Prashasti to elevate their images. Through Prashastis, we learn a lot about the ruler's reign, military campaigns, and sometimes their religious belief. For example, Samudragupta's Prashasti talks about how he defeated many kingdoms but also welcomed some of them into his empire, showing him as a merciful ruler. Prashasti also reflect the cultural environment of the time. The use of Sanskrit and the focus on poetry show how much value was placed on art and culture during the Gupta period. Other rulers like Gautamiputra Sri Satkarni and Chandragupta Maurya also had Prashasti written about them. Just like Samudragupta, these rulers used Prashasti to highlight their military victories, wisdom, and divine qualities. To sum up, the Prashastis are not just poems, but important historical sources that tell us about the rulers, their reigns, and the society of their time. Let's take a closer look at the fascinating part of Samudragupta's Prashasti. This inscription, written by poet Harisena, paints a vivid picture of the king as a warrior and a ruler. It tells us not only about Samudragupta's personal qualities, but also about how King fought was during the Gupta period. From this description, we can infer a few things about Samudragupta. The poet is highlighting the bravery and the courage of the king. The use of words like marks of hundreds of scars shows that Samudragupta was not just a distant ruler, but a hands-on warrior who personally participated in battles. The use of words like marks of hundreds of scars shows that Samudragupta was not just a distant ruler, but a hands-on warrior who personally participated in battles. His scars, caused by a variety of weapons, tell us that he was deeply involved in the fighting, enduring many hardships. By calling these scars plenteous beauty, as it is called here, plenteous beauty, the poet elevates these physical wounds to a symbol of honor and valor. In this way, the poet is not just describing a king, but glorifying his warrior identity, which was a key part of royal image in ancient India. The long list of weapons like battle axe, arrows, spikes, spears, barbed darts, etc., shows us that war was brutal and involved many different kind of weapons. It wasn't just about archery or sword fighting, it was a combination of various weapons that made battle intense and dangerous. Moreover, the fact that Samudragupta is described as physically scarred by these weapons also suggests that kings weren't merely commanding from a distance. They were expected to fight alongside their soldiers, leading by example on the battlefield. This is different from some later periods when kings might not have directly participated in wars and were seen more as a symbolic figures. Kings were expected to be the warrior kings, strong, capable, and physically involved in protecting their empire. This portrayal of the kings aligned with the idealized image of rulers in ancient India, where kings were often equated with divine or semi-divine figure. Let's see how Harisena The poet and minister in Samudragupta court described the king's relationship with four different kinds of rulers. Each of these groups had a distinct role and a treatment in Samudragupta's empire. First, Harisena talks about the rulers of Aryavrata. The region shows in green on the map. This region. Aryavrata is roughly the area of North India, including the region around modern-day Delhi, Uttar Pradesh, and Haryana. There were 9 rulers who were uprooted by Samudragupta, meaning they were defeated and their kingdom were absorbed into Samudragupta empire. This shows that Samudragupta was aggressive in his territorial expansion in the northern parts of the India. He didn't just defeat these rulers but directly incorporated their territories into his own empire, strengthening his control over Aryavarta. Next, we have the rulers of Dakshinapad, which included regions of southern India. These regions are pointed as red dot. These rulers didn't just lose in battles. After being defeated, they surrendered to Samudragupta. The interesting part is that Samudragupta did not completely annex their lands. Instead, he allowed them to continue ruling, but only after they acknowledged his superiority. This policy shows a more lenient side to Samudragupta. Rather than uprooting these rulers, he reinstated them as his vassals, making sure they recognize his authority. Now then there is a mention of inner circle of neighboring state, which includes places like Assam, coastal Bengal, these area. Nepal, several Gana Sanghas. Gana Sangha means tribal republic in the northwest. This area is marked in purple on the map. Finally, there were the rulers of outlying area marked in blue on the map. These areas. This include regions such as those that were once part of the Kushanas and Shakas empire, as well as the rulers of Sri Lanka. These rulers submitted to Samudragupta and offered daughters in marriage as a token of submission and goodwill. This shows that Samudragupta had diplomatic relations not only with neighboring regions but also with far-off kingdom. The act of offering daughters in marriage was a common diplomatic gesture, symbolizing alliance and peace between kingdoms. It's a way of showing loyalty and creating political ties through marriages. So what we learn from these 4 different groups and Samudragupta's policies towards them. First one is aggressive expansion. Samudragupta expanded his empire in northern India by defeating and annexing territories. Second is diplomatic alliance. He showed leniency in southern India, allowing defeated rulers to continue ruling as long as they accepted his authority. Now the next is tributary system. Next is tributary system. For nearby kingdoms, Samudragupta established a system where they sent tribute, followed his orders and attended his court. Last one is far-reaching diplomacy. Even distant regions like the Kushanas, Shakas and Sri Lanka were brought into Samudragupta's sphere through diplomatic submission, including marital alliance. There are some questions given here. I think after the discussion, you will be able to answer this question. I think we have answered almost all the questions in the discussion. Now then let's see how Prashasti described the ancestors of rulers, particularly focusing on Samudragupta and his family. We will also explore the titles used by his ancestor and what they tell us about the rise of the Gupta dynasty. Most Prashastis, including Samudragupta's, mention the ancestor of the ruler to establish their family lineage and legitimacy. This is important because a ruler's ancestry is used to demonstrate the royal bloodline and divine connection, which added to their authority. In Samudragupta's case, his great-grandfather, grandfather, father and mother all are mentioned. Now his mother Kumara Devi belonged to the Lichavi Ghana. His father Chandragupta was the first ruler of the Gupta dynasty to adopt the title of Maharaja Dhiraj. a significant and grand title that Samudragupta also used. This demonstrated that Samudragupta came from a powerful and noble lineage. His family rise to prominence is evident through the titles they use. Now, let's arrange the title in order of importance. First is Maharaja Dhiraj. This is the most important title. It literally means King of the Kings or Supreme Ruler, indicating a high rank and authority over other kings. This title was adopted by Samudragupta's father Chandragupta and was also used by Samudragupta himself. It shows that they held the top position in the region. Now second is Maharaj. This title translates to great kings and was used by Samudragupta great grandfather and grandfather. It indicates that they were powerful rulers but not quite at the level of Maharaja Dhiraj. This shows that the family gradually rose in prominence over time. Now the third is Raja. This is the least significant title in this context. It means king, but compared to Maharaja Dhiraj and Maharaja, it is more common and less exalted title. The rulers with this title were not considered supreme or great king, but they still had considerable power in the region. Samudragupta's legacy was so important that he figures in the genealogy of later rulers of the Gupta dynasty, especially his son Chandragupta II. These genealogies were meant to show the continuation of the Gupta royal line and the prestige of their ancestors. We know about Chandragupta II from various inscriptions and coins, which tells us about his military achievements and the cultural and intellectual prosperity during his reign. One of his most notable campaigns was his expedition to Western India, where he defeated the last of the Shakas, an important military victory. This expanded the Gupta Empire. Chandragupta II's reign is also associated with great cultural achievement. It is believed that his court was filled with learned people, including Kalidas, one of the greatest poets in Indian history, and Aryabhatta, the famous astronomer. This period is often referred to as the Golden Age of India, as it witnessed significant development in art, literature, science, and philosophy. Harshvardhan ruled nearly 1400 years ago. To understand his reign, we can turn to various sources. Inscription and coins provide us with concrete evidence of his rule, but it is also through biographies like the Harsha Charita that we get a more personal glimpse into his life. The Harsha Charita was written by Banabhatta, Harsha's court poet, and it not only gives us genealogy but also narrates how Harsha rose to power, starting with his family background. Harsha wasn't the eldest son. He became the king of Thanesar after both his father and elder brother died. It wasn't a typical path to the throne, but fate had other plans. Meanwhile, Harsha's brother-in-law ruled Kannauj, but was tragically killed by the ruler of Bengal. Harsha determined to avenge his brother-in-law's death, took control of Kannauj, and decided to march into Bengal to confront the Bengal rulers. Harsha was successful in the east. He conquered Magad and Bengal, expanding his empire significantly. However, his ambition didn't stop there. He tried to push further south, crossing the Narmada River to march into the Deccan. But he was stopped in his track by Pulkeshin II, a powerful ruler from the Chalukya dynasty. His campaign into the southern regions came to an abrupt halt. Now let's look at the region Harsha passed through during this campaign. First, when he moved toward Bengal, he would have crossed modern-day states like Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, and Bihar. These regions were crucial in his conquest of Bengal. And when he tried to move south, this side to the Narmada, Harsha would have passed through Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, heading towards the Deccan Plateau. So what can we learn from Harsha's story? Harsha's rise to power wasn't by inheritance, but through circumstances. He expanded his kingdom in the east, conquering Magad and Bengal, but his ambition was thwarted by the Pulkeshin II in the south. Harsha's military journey took him through modern-day Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. Harshvardhan's reign is a testament to the ambition and struggle of ancient rulers. His life, captured through writings like Harsha Charita, an account from travelers like Zunjam, provide us with valuable insight into the political and military landscape of ancient India. Now let's explore about the Chalukyas, Pallavas, Chalukyas and Pulkeshin Prashasti. During the early medieval period, South India was dominated by two major dynasties, the Pallavas and the Chalukyas. These kingdoms not only fought for territorial control but also for control over the coast, which were crucial for their prosperity. The Pallavas ruled from Kanchipuram and their kingdom stretched down to the Kaveri Delta. The Chalukyas, on the other hand, controlled a vast region between the Krishna and Tungbhadra rivers, with their capital at Aihole. The conflict between these two dynasties was intense, with frequent raids, especially targeting each other's coastal town. Now, why were these coastal areas so important? These were important simply because coastal regions were gateways for trade, commerce, and naval power. These regions were rich in resources, and whoever controlled them could dominate both land and sea. Now, coastal regions were important for trade, especially maritime trade routes linking India to Southeast Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and the beyond. Ports like Mamallapuram, also known as Mahabalipuram, and Kanchipuram in the east and Konkan in the west, became major hub for the exchange of goods like spices, timber, and salt. Now let's talk about one of the most well-known Chalukya ruler, Pulkeshin II. We know about him mainly from a prashasti or eulogy written by his court poet Ravikirti. According to Ravikirti, Pulkeshin wasn't just a local ruler. He led expedition along both the east and west coast. His most significant achievement was that he halted the expansion of Harshvardhan, the northern king who had set his sight on the south. And here is a fun little detail from Ravi Kirti's poem. It is written here that Harsha means happiness, but after Pulkeshin defeated him, the poet wrote that Harsha was no longer Harsha. I guess it was a clever play on words to show how Harsha's happiness was shattered by his defeat. Pulkeshin also took on the Pallava king, who had to hide behind the walls of Kanchipuram. However, despite these victories, Pulkeshin's success didn't last forever. The Pallavas would regroup, and eventually both the Chalukyas and Pallavas would give way to the rise of other mighty dynasties like the Rashtrakutas and Cholas. After the Chalukya, the Rashtrakuta and the Cholas would also compete for control over coastal region. The Cholas in particular became famous for their naval power and extended their influence over parts of Southeast Asia, creating a naval empire. Their control over the Coromandel coast and their dominance over trade routes made them one of the most powerful maritime powers of the time. Now, why were the coastal areas so important? First of all, due to economic prosperity. Control over the seas allowed rulers to defend their territory and assert dominance over the trade routes. Second is the cultural influence. Coastal regions were also key in spreading India's culture, religion, and art, especially through maritime interaction with the Southeast Asia. Ultimately, the Pallavas, Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, and Cholas all sought to control these strategic coastal regions for the economic, military, and cultural advantages they offered. But in the end, it was the Chola who established a long-lasting naval empire in the region. Now the next is, how were these kingdoms administered? In ancient Indian kingdom, particularly those like the Pallavas, Chalukyas, and other during the early medieval period, administration was crucial for maintaining power and stability. Much like in earlier times, land revenue remained an essential source of income for these rulers. However, there were new developments in how the kingdom were governed. One such development was the hereditary system of administration. Let's explore how this system worked and the advantages and the disadvantages it posed. Now, the hereditary officer meant that the certain administrative posts were passed down from father to son, establishing a dynastic form of administration for those specific roles. This could be seen in position like a Mahadandanayaka, and which is chief judicial officer held by the poet Harisena, which was inherited from his father. Let's first look at the advantages of this system. There are a few important points to consider here. First is stability and continuity. The hereditary system ensured that important positions were held by experienced individuals who had been groomed for the role over generation. This helped in ensuring continuity in administration. For instance, Harishena's father, also a Mahadanda Nayaka, would have imparted his knowledge and expertise to his son, leading to more effective governance. Because these roles were passed down within families, they also promoted stability within the administration. When officers were trained within the family lineage, they could understand local issue deeply and provide consistent governance. Now, second is efficiency and expertise. Inheriting a position meant the person taking over was usually well trained, especially if the family had a tradition of holding the post. This system allowed for a smooth transition in leadership with minimal disruption in administrative function. Now, hereditary position helped to maintain efficiency in administrative functions, as individuals already had a deep understanding of their roles and the challenges that came with it. This was particularly crucial in roles like the military strategy, finance, and law enforcement. However, while there are advantages, there are also some notable disadvantages to the hereditary system of administration. Let's examine these in more detail. Hereditary positions were based on birthright, not necessarily merit or competency. This means that sometimes individuals who inherited a position were not as capable or skilled as required. For instance, a son might inherit a position such as Mahadanda Nayaka, which is chief judicial officer, without the skill or intellectual capacity of his father. This could lead to poor governance or corruption if the officer did not perform well. Hereditary position often led to a sense of stagnation within the administration. Since these roles were handed down within families, there were little incentive for ideas or innovative approaches to governance. While loyalty to the king was a key advantage, power struggle within families could also arise, especially when brothers or cousins fought for control over the same position. Such internal conflicts could destabilize the administration and even lead to the creation of independent factions or breakaway kingdom, weakening central authority. Powerful families could even become too influential, undermining the king's authority. When powerful families controlled administrative posts for generation, there was always the possibility of corruption. The lack of accountability within a hereditary system sometimes allowed for the accumulation of wealth and power through bribery or nepotism. Hereditary officers who were not held accountable by merit-based promotions might focus more on personal gain rather than the welfare of the kingdom. Ultimately, these disadvantages contributed to the decline of many powerful dynasties. Some hereditary officers grew so strong that they set up independent kingdom, further weakening the central power. In the early medieval period, kingdom in India had a well-organized military structure, much like earlier dynasties. Kings maintained large, powerful armies that were essential for both defense and expansion of their territories. These armies often consisted of elephant, chariots, cavalry, and foot soldiers, a mix of forces that helped the king respond effectively to external threat and internal rebellion. However, one of the most important innovation in the military system of this time was the emergence of Samanta system. Samantas. Samantas were military leaders or local lords who provided soldiers or Samantas were military leaders or local lords who provided soldiers and resources for the king's army. However, unlike regular soldiers who were paid a salary, Samantas were given land grants by the ruler. This land grant was a form of payment for the military services they provided. While the system was effective for organizing forces and ensuring military support, it had its challenges. As the Samantas gained control over their land and resources, they became more powerful. In times when the king's rule weakened, these military leaders often tried to become independent rulers. This led to the fragmentation of power as regional rulers grew stronger and loyalty to the central authority declined. In summary, the Samanta system helped king gather military support without the need for regular pay, but also led to the rise of independent rulers, weakening centralized authority. Now let's see assemblies in southern India. Imagine a time when local communities were responsible for managing their own affairs. There were no central authority to oversee village or town. Instead, the power was vested in local bodies like the Sabha, the Ur, and the Nagaram. Let's look how these assemblies functioned and what role these plays and what they reveal about the governance in ancient India. The Pallavas, who ruled over other over parts of South India from the 4th century to the 9th century CE, provide us with a rich inscription detailing the functioning of local governance. These inscriptions give us a glimpse into a time when local assemblies had an important role in administration, society, and even economic management. Let's start with the Sabha. The Sabha was a council of Brahmin landowners. It was a structured and influential body that played a crucial role in the administration of local affairs. Think of it as a local government in the ancient world, but with specific responsibility. The Sabha had subcommittee to handle various functions. Let's dig a bit deeper to know about the functions. First one is irrigation, ensuring that the irrigation system were maintained for agriculture and overseeing the agriculture practices, ensuring the smooth functioning of farming activities, developing and maintaining road for better connectivity. Since temples were central to the social and religious life, the Sabha was also responsible for their upkeep. In a way, the Sabha was the backbone of local governance in regions where Brahmin landowners held sway. Next is the Ur. Now we have the Ur, which was a village assembly. The key difference between the Sabha and the Ur was that the Ur was found in areas where the landowners were not Brahmins. This point you should keep in mind. So the Ur was more representative of the general population, which included peasants, artisans, and other local landowners. Despite these differences, the function of the Ur were quite similar to the Sabha. It was responsible for maintaining village infrastructure, agriculture, operations, and local governance. Finally, there was the Nagaram, an assembly of merchants. The presence of the Nagaram reflects the importance of trade and commerce in the Pallava period. These merchant organizations were involved in regulating market, activities, and trade, which was crucial for the local economy. The Nagaram was less about governance and more focused on the economic and the commercial activities of the town or city. It is important to remember that, like most local bodies in ancient times, these assemblies were often controlled by the rich and powerful landowners and merchants. While these assemblies were designed to ensure local administration, the concentration of power in the hands of few elite groups meant that this system could sometimes work to the advantage of the wealthy. These assemblies highlight the decentralized nature of the governance during this period, where local affairs were largely handled by local bodies. The rich landowners and merchants likely had considerable control over these assemblies, thus leading to a concentration of power in the hands of the elite. Let's take a closer look at the lives of ordinary people in ancient kingdoms, particularly through the lens of classic literature. The Chinese pilgrim Fahian, who traveled to India in the 5th century CE, provides a vivid description of the social condition of the time. His account highlights the discrimination faced by those considered untouchables in society. Fahian notes that those who were treated as untouchable were forced to live on the outskirts of towns and market, indicating their marginalized status in society. To ensure that others kept their distance, untouchables were expected to carry a piece of wood and strike it when entering public spaces. This sound acted as a warning signal for people to avoid contact with them. This account paints a picture of the deep social stratification and the caste-based discrimination prevalent at the time, where untouchables were not allowed to mix freely with others in society. Another important source we can turn to for understanding this is the work of Kalidas, one of the India's greatest playwrights. His plays give us a glimpse into the lives of both the elites and the common folk. Let's explore how Kalidasa's Shakuntalam sheds light on the lives of ordinary people, how it reflects the social structure of the time. When we think about ancient Indian kingdom, we often picture kings and queens and warriors and scholars. But what about the common man or woman? What was their life like? Kalidasa's plays offer us a rare glimpse into the lives of ordinary people. In particular, Abhigyana Sakuntalam not only tells the story of royalty and love, but also highlights the struggle of those at the bottom of social ladder, such as a poor fisherman. One interesting feature of Kalidasa's play is the distinction in language. Sanskrit is used by kings and Brahmins, representing their intellectual and spiritual superiority, while Prakrit is used by ordinary men and women, symbolizing their social status as commoners. This linguistic divide is crucial because it reflects the social hierarchy of the time. The elite classes spoke in Sanskrit, which was the language of the learned, of religious ritual, and of governance. On the other hand, Prakrit is a vernacular language, was used by those from the lower social strata, such as the poor merchants and laborers. Kalidas Abhigyan Shakuntalam is not just a tale of love and royalty, it also offers important insight into the social fabric of ancient India. The contrast between the language of the elite and the common people, along with the portrayal of the poor fisherman's struggle, help us understand the deep social and economic divide of the time. I think we have covered answers of these questions in the discussion. Try to write in your own words. Now let's read this paragraph and see what is this all about. The king's army. Banabhatta, a 7th century Indian author, provides a vivid account of the king's army on the move. His descriptions are important for understanding the logistic and scale of royal expedition during ancient times. The king's army was not just about weapons and soldiers. The king's army was not just about weapons and soldiers. It was accompanied by a vast amount of supplies, showcasing the royal grandeur and the complexity of military campaign during that era. These were the primary items for the army's defense, essential for protection during the journey and any conflict that might arise. Everyday cooking and food preparation items were essential for sustaining the large army of people accompanying the army. To maintain comfort and royal decorum, furniture such as chairs and stools, possibly for the king and high-ranking officials, were carried. Golden footstools were also carried. This highlights the luxury of the king's entourage, as golden items were symbol of wealth and royal status. These included animals such as goats, deer, and rabbit, as well as vegetables and spices. The army needed adequate food supplies to sustain them during long journeys. Now, musicians were also included. They were accompanied by musicians who played drums, horns, and trumpets, likely for morale, signaling, and possibly for ceremonial purpose. Let's see what was the impact on villagers. The king army, despite its grand and well-organized nature, often brought destruction to the local village along its route. Elephant, a part of the royal entourage, would trample down the herds of the villagers, highlighting the unintentional destruction caused by movement of such large forces. The oxen used by merchants in caravans were often scared off due to the tumultuous noise caused by the army, disrupting local commerce. Banabhatta describes how the entire area seemed to be swallowed up in dust, a metaphor for the chaos and disruption caused by the army's passage. Now, what was the villagers' contribution to the king's army? As the king's army passed through these villages, the local population was expected to provide hospitality and assistance. This was likely an established practice during royal journeys or military campaigns. Villagers would bring gifts of curds, gold, and flowers as token of respect and hospitality. The villagers were also expected to provide fodder for the animals of the king's army, such as elephant, horses, and pack animals. Many villagers would try to meet the kings personally, presenting their compliments and sometimes complaints also and petitions, hoping for royal intervention or assistance. Now let's see what was happening in other parts of the world. This passage provides a historical overview of the Arabian Peninsula and the rise of Islam. Arabia is a desert region, but despite its harsh environment, it was at the center of important trade routes for centuries. Arab merchants and sailors were key players in the trade between India and Europe, helping to facilitate the exchange of goods, culture, and ideas. The region's location allowed it to be crossroad for different civilizations and a center for economic and cultural interactions. Bedouins were nomadic tribe who lived in the Arabian desert. They were pastoralists, meaning they raised animals and relied on them for survival. Camels were particularly important to the Bedouins because they could survive in the harsh desert environment, providing the people with food, transportation, and trade goods. Around 1400 years ago, a significant change occurred in Arabia with the arrival of Islam, a religion introduced by the Prophet Muhammad. Islam emphasized equality and unity among all people before Allah, the supreme God. It taught that men and women, regardless of their social status or gender, could earn forgiveness and a great reward from Allah if they lived devout, righteous life. The Quran and the Holy Book of Islam outlines this principle, and the verse shared in the text highlight the qualities that Allah values in both men and women: patience, charity, fasting, chastity, and constant remembrance of God. 100 years of Prophet Muhammad's death, Islam spread rapidly from its birthplace in Arabia to regions like North Africa, Spain, Iran, and India. Arab sailors who had long established trade routes and interaction with coastal settlement in the Indian subcontinent played a key role in spreading Islam. They carried the new religion with them as they traveled, helping it to spread far beyond Arabia. Additionally, Arab soldiers conquered regions like Sindh in modern-day Pakistan around 1300 years ago, further extending the reach of Islam. Now the next we will do the exercise given here. Now let's start with the exercise. First one is let's recall, in which we have to match the following. Now Mohinder, as we know, Mohinder is related to three kings of that time. Those were Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas. Now next one is Lord of the Dakshinapath. Lord of the Dakshinapath, as we know, were Satavahanas rulers. Ashwaghosha is related to Buddha Charita. Bodhisattvas related to Mahayana Buddhism. And Zunjiang was a Chinese pilgrim. Now the next question is, why did kings want to control the Silk Route? Now Silk Route connected China with Central Asia and India with the Europe and West Asia, facilitating the exchange of ideas, goods, and culture. It was named after silk that was primarily exported from China. Now silk was highly valued in ancient Rome, where only elite and royal families could afford it. The demand for silk led to the significant flow of gold into China. By imposing the taxes on the silk, king could generate revenue to boost their economy. Now culture and diplomatic exchanges took place. Silk Route facilitated the spread of Buddhism from India to China. It also helped in the strengthening trade alliances. Now because of the political and military importance, many powerful rulers like Kanishka from Kushan dynasty controlled key part of the Silk Road to maintain dominance over strategic location. Now the next question is, what kinds of evidence do historians use to find out about trade and trade routes? Now historians use multiple sources to study trade and trade route. Some of them include archaeological evidence such as artifacts such as jewelry, pottery, tools found in different regions indicate trade between civilization. For example, several artifacts from the Roman Empire have been found at Lothal, suggesting trade link between Rome and ancient India. Now the inscription and seals, the discovery of seals and inscription in different regions provide evidence of trade relationship between the distant places. Now written records, accounts of travelers and historians describe trade and cultural exchange between civilizations. Like writings of Ibn Battuta, Marco Polo, Fahayan, and Zunjiang provide valuable insight into historical trade and interactions. Now through these resources, historians and archaeologists reconstruct the past and understand ancient trade networks. Now the next question is, what were the main features of Bhakti? The Bhakti movement emphasized intense personal devotion to a deity, focusing on love and surrender rather than spiritualistic practices. It emerged as a response to rigid caste division and priestly dominance. Now Bhakti promoted to a deep personal connection with deities like Shiva, Vishnu, Worship became more emotional and direct, reducing reliance on ritual and priestly meditation. The movement opposed complex Vedic rituals and sacrifices, encouraging simpler form of worship, such as singing hymn and reciting poems. Saints like Kabir and Mirabai spread these ideas through devotional songs. Now, Bhakti rejected caste and gender discrimination, allowing everyone, including lower caste and women, to participate in religious practices. Saints like Ravi Das and Chokha Mela emphasized devotion over birth-based hierarchy. Now, views of vernacular language. Bhakti saints composed poetry and hymns in local languages, making religious ideas accessible to common people. In the next video, we will be starting the next chapter, that is chapter 11, New Empires and Kingdoms. Thank you.